army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast. This is episode 74, Modern Antifa Communist Insurgency in the U.S., Part 3. So, for those of you who may be stepping into the breach here to listen to this episode independent of the first two parts, which were 72 and 73, and I think that what I'm trying to do here is make a case that is both linear and non-linear, but it is tremendously important for us to put the building blocks together before we proceed forward. So in a typical note to my listeners, I would recommend that you listen to the other two before you listen to this one. In episode 72, I discussed the origins of 20th century communism and its influence in the United States. And in the second one, we fast forwarded to the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and to borrow Brian Burrows' phrase, the days of rage of the communist insurgency that went kinetic during that time. Today, we're going to go back to basics a little bit in order to discuss what is communism and what can we gather from that to make sure we get the single most accurate picture of this very thing or complex of things that we're trying to analyze here. And in this case, I'm in favor of using an umbrella rubric for this, which would be government supremacism, those who prize the notion of the collective over the individual. E.O. Wilson, the insect specialist, and I guess one could call him an evolutionary biologist of sorts, was the one who was asked, well, what do you think of socialism? Or maybe it was communism. His response was rather simple and elegant in my mind. Great idea, wrong species. He being a renowned scientist who had studied the ecology and community of ants and other insect behavior, because in the end, communism, socialism, National Socialism, all of these isms that embrace themselves under collectivism, under the rubric that I refer to as government supremacism, are all those that communicate one singular idea in the end, which is the subservience of individuals and communities of individuals to the collective and political will of single entities in the state. So this entire People's Front of Judea and Judean People's Front bifurcation between National Socialism and communism, as we have seen, which is so popular in the United States and by extension the West, especially in Europe, where they use this as a defining moment to say that this is right-wing and that is left-wing. And what it basically means is that they're saying left-wing and right-wing, referring back to the late 18th century infamous and bloody French Revolution, which used the left side of the aisle to define the government supremacists, as it were. And in this case, it wasn't that the right side of the aisle was so much the definitional standard for individualism as the definitional standard for monarchy, which, of course, over hundreds of years, if not over a millennia, had changed from a God-given right to one in which those on the throne wearing the crown would sometimes say, oh, indeed, this is my God-given right, but they tried to democratize it to a certain extent by making it more manifest and doing the will of the people, as it were. I happen to think that left and right is magical thinking. It's misdirection. It's legerdemain. It's a way to artificially induce constructs of difference where no real difference of any value is. For instance, there are those who say, well, there's fascism, and there's communism, and there's socialism. When it comes to communists brandage the weapon and are not worried about the optics. When it comes to socialism, they tend to hide the weapon and not brandish it. That weapon comes out later on. When it comes to fascism, which by a variety of definitions, and I'm not going to rely when it comes to politics for the definitions that are accepted in a dictionary or anything like that, because it's much more nuanced of a conversation to have when it comes to that. I'm going to give you what I would say is my definition of fascism, which is the vertical and horizontal regulatory and taxation framework in advanced modern states that uses that to manipulate, influence, and even direct how private entities, corporations, and firms behave in that country. For instance, there is a tremendous regulatory framework in the United States, same thing in the European Union, same thing in other countries around the world, and what all of us would call the first world. So, in essence, what we have here is a spectrum of domination by the state that is either lesser or total, and everything in between. When it comes to anarchy would be the definitional standard by which there are no rulers but only rules, but that tends to be something that is arguably non-existent around the world as far as nation states are concerned, but you do find that the more developing world or third world centric these various entities may be that are not members of the first world, that they tend to socialism, communism, kleptocracies, which is nation states by theft. They could be cacocracies, nation states run by the worst among them. There are those who are of the opinion that anybody who seeks political office most likely doesn't deserve that political office because they wish to rule over others. I remember one time when I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and he was going on about why it was so necessary for the state to exist and why individuals could not responsibly or rationally direct their own atomistic actions and transactions in a relatively free society, and that they needed a yoke of sorts on them. To which I responded, so where do we find these individuals who are so gifted and so knowledgeable about all the billions of pieces of transactional information, the data and the datum in the everyday decisions that are made by individuals? How does one person or that person and their delegated regulatory apparatus rule over millions if single people can't rule themselves? Nonetheless, that's rather rhetorical. We didn't come up with an answer, but it made for good conversational fodder. As a trained Austrian economist, we're going to go a little bit off the reservation today when it comes to irregular warfare, impending conflict, wars, military affairs, and that stuff. And we're going to dig a little bit in the weeds on what are these formative root causes and proximate causes that have brought us to the state of nature the United States is presently at when it comes to what I would say is an incipient, asymmetrical, one could say, civil war that is emerging here in the United States. Now, will the UK beat the US to civil war? I suspect that that may very well be the case. If you had a chance to listen to an episode I did several episodes ago about civil war, I mentioned Dr. David Betts, who actually makes a living and gets paid to think about these things, unlike myself, where I do this as an avocational hobby to think about these things. But he's actually a scholar over there who does really good work. And he said if midnight is the time that things go kinetic in a civil war, there are a few moments from midnight in the United Kingdom. And what has brought them to this, of course, is politics. And politics in this case is going to be those factions and fractions of a given population that are seeking domination over and sustenance from captive populations within the borders of recognized sovereign states. So what I'm trying to do here is to provide an explanatory framework where we examine a little bit of these belief systems, and of course, mankind, especially since the cusp of the 18th century until this time, has been examining this relationship between the state and individuals. So what we're going to try to tease out here is that I'm assuming that you've listened to the other two episodes, so we're going to proceed forward with this notion that there is a communist insurgency in the United States, and we're going to try to tease out where does that come from. Well, where it comes from, if we're looking for patient zero, in this case, it's the education system. The education system that has largely been reflected in Western nations was one that is largely credited to Prussia in 1763, where they established the first compulsory primary education system. Horace Mann discovered this in the 19th century. He championed a common school movement in the United States, which would later, especially blooming in the 20th century, would become a wholly owned subsidiary of the national government and the respective states, so that those states would become the primary provisioners of that, accepting private schools, or as we did, we home educated all of our children because we did not want them exposed to what that system has become over time. 1837, Horace Mann, considered the father of American education, began the reforms which led to what we see today, and by 1870, all states had tax-supported elementary schools, though attendance was not always mandatory. In the 19th century, that attendance tended to be mandatory through the 9th grade as they established it then. And then with the 20th century, it became popular with the innovations in creating 9 through 12 and high school and such. And then, of course, collegiate ambition in the United States and European countries. Fast forwarding past World War II, we discover that in the 1950s and 60s, unlike other countries, the United States started to imbue in its citizenry that a college education, whether it was in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or things that have a lesser analytical and empirical rigor to them, the studies, sociology, dare I say economics, as a trained Austrian economist myself, and others where all of a sudden university attendance became massive in the United States. Those historical trends really started to ramp up by 1970. 1970 to 2010, significant expansion in college enrollment, with total enrollment nearly quadrupling to a peak of 21 million students by 2010. And post-2010 has seen something of a reversal of this trend, but when you tease out the figures, what you see is a reversal in male enrollment versus female enrollment, and female enrollment, for a variety of reasons in non-STEM, has started to exceed male enrollment in the same. Colleges became enormously expensive over time. Part of this was the moral hazard of the underwriting by states and the federal government of college loans, which led to tremendous expansion of those who had student debt and such. But what this also led to is almost a breeding ground, an orchid house for collectivist thinking, especially among non-STEM college attendees, graduates, those doing postgraduate work. What you started to find was that these were certainly universities and not heteroversities, because the left of center, to use that tired old trope that I tried to dispose of just a few minutes ago, but we're going to stick with it because that seems to be the explanatory framework in sphere of understanding that most people apprehend. Left of center would mean more government. Right of center would mean less government, even though I don't think that's the way it necessarily works out, because I like to use the bifurcation between individualism and collectivism. And collectivism, of course, is harnessed to interventionism, whether that's domestic or war-making overseas, whereas individualism tends not to adopt interventionism as the way to preserve freedom and liberty when not under threat and not engage in wars of choice. But from the end of World War II until today, it is undeniable that when it comes to the professoriate in the academy and the university and those who are teaching, those holders of PhDs or their aspirants who are seeking PhDs who happen to be teaching assistants, who amazingly enough tend to teach nearly half of all classes in four-year schools and such. At the National Association of Scholars, they had an interesting article where the article said, why are most college professors liberal? New studies investigate. Two studies. Does a certain political orientation boost a person's chances of getting in, of wanting to go in the first place? Peter Wood discusses both reports and articles at the Chronicle of Higher Education Innovations blog. In one study, which Peter called well-intentioned but essentially worthless, the author sent fake letters to graduate admissions officers expressing interest in attending the program. Some letters mentioned working in either the Obama or McCain campaign. Gross and his co-authors wanted to see whether these letters would get responses that indicated encouragement or discouragement according to which candidates were mentioned. It seems fatuous and silly on its face. So I agree with him that seems like a pretty worthless study. The other one sought to analyze the reasons people have for seeking PhDs. And Peter writes, quote, why is the professoriate predominantly liberal? A, because there is an intrinsic link between liberalism and intelligence, such that the more liberal views of those with advanced degrees reflect liberals' greater academic potentials. The liberals are smarter theory. B, because cognitive development occurs within additional years of schooling, leading the intelligentsia to find fault with what they see as simplistic conservative ideologies. The more learning makes profits, liberal theory. C, because the professoriate seeks a way to differentiate itself from both the middle class and business elites. The profs turn liberal because they resent the middle class theory. D, because the entrenched liberals who dominate knowledge work fields refuse to hire colleagues with the dissenting opinions. The liberals are biased against conservatives theory. E, because the professoriate acquired a reputation as a liberal occupation, and liberals today acting on the basis of this reputation and seeking careers that accord with their political identities are more likely than conservatives to aspire to become academics, the self-selection theory. F, because conservatives are dogmatic and turn away from disciplines that require open-mindedness, the liberals are more open-minded theory. G, because professors tend more than most Americans to reside in cities and have fewer children, which favors their embracing liberal political views, the lifestyle liberalism theory. H, because professors are on average less religious than other Americans, which corresponds with their being more liberal. The grad school appeals to secularist theory. I, because conservatives are more materialistic and are drawn to private sector jobs, while liberals concerned more with their sense of meaning are more likely to be drawn to academic work. The conservatives prefer money to learning theory. This catalog of explanations is to be found in the first 11 pages of a new working paper by Ethan Foss, Jeremy Fries, and Neil Gross, released yesterday. Their answer is an emphatic E, self-selection. In their view, is the only answer for which they can find robust empirical support. If they are right, this should change one of the longest running and often most bitter debates in contemporary higher education. Peter concludes that self-selection is by no means ruling out the possibility of bias. The most effective way, he says, is to keep out a whole class of people who are unwelcome, isn't to bar entry, but to make sure that very few in that class will want to enter. So again, they said E, because the professoriate acquired a reputation as a liberal occupation, liberals today acting on the basis of that reputation and seeking careers that accord with their political identities are more likely than conservatives to aspire to become academics. I find these explanatory frameworks intriguing, but not wholesale compelling. What I would tell you is that having been a visiting professor at a real university, in this case, Ole Miss, the entire system from administration to selection to PhD boards to those who oversee PhD aspirants and all of it militates against anyone who doesn't share the left of center government supremacist framework that the majority of these practitioners do. Remember, in the university system, it is idyllic. I have fond memories of my rather large office when I taught there, festooned with all of my books, making me look much more studied than I actually am. And I just loved the groove of it, loved all of it, but found that I disagreed morally and intellectually, and more so empirically, with most of my colleagues in my particular profession there. I have found that when it comes to academia, they have a tendency to become not only a house of mirrors, but an echo chamber of sorts, in which, as I mentioned, it is a university and not a heteroversity, because they do not entertain other kinds of thought patterns and apprehensions of the world that don't conform to what they wish to express as the virtue of being left of center, whether that's a liberal, a leftist, a socialist, a national socialist, a communist, or whatever the case may be. I think this is one explanation why classics departments are dying on the vine and why classicists themselves, shout out to Victor Davis Hanson, don't want to learn Greek. They don't want to learn Latin. They don't want to learn the older languages that allow them to access the primary source documentation for their profession. In the historical profession, whether I am a member of the Organization of American Historians or the American Historical Association, both of these have been commandeered by Marxoid professors and thought leaders and intelligentsia for decades, if not generations, and they do not allow the publication of things that fly in the face of these given totems and shibboleths that inform how they view the world, how they see the world. This is the same historical profession that has good-meaning people like Mary Beard, the Roman and Greek historian, more so Roman, who has written both novels and nonfiction works out of the United Kingdom, who suffers from that historical sin of sins, which is presentism, in which she has gone to great lengths to take her contemporary feelings, morals, and political viewpoints and try to project them backwards in time. For instance, how many women participated in positions of power. She's gone on of late to even say that trans may have been a part of what was going on at the time. Presentism means that you are taking your core beliefs of today and you are projecting those backwards, and you're wondering why they did not have the high, elevated, and prestigious moral positions that you hold today, and you can hold them at arm's length and condemn them for being the dim-witted and morally darkened peoples that they were, for not accepting these things, which, by the way, didn't happen to be in their moral imagination at the time. For instance, slavery is a big deal as far as contemporary historical analysis and such. Of course, when it comes to race, class, and gender, that is the trifecta which informs almost all academic journaling today in the journals, all these electronic journals that are out there and available for folks to read if they wish. I would urge you not to if you get the opportunity, because it is so filled with jargon, nonsense, plagiarism, and a total lack of reproducibility, and even footnotes that don't speak to what the author or authors of said journal article were using them to speak to in the first place because they twist it up. If you get the opportunity to go to a place like Retraction Watch, you will discover that the amount of journalistic fraud, plagiarism, and stupidity is so rampant. And I have had a running plea to Elon Musk or whoever has the means to fund this to develop an AI investigation and forensic tool that goes to every electronic academic journal in America and around the world. Let's start with the English language. And you examine it for its data provenance. You examine it for its data accuracy, its precision of language. You examine the footnotes versus the conjectures and speculation and conclusions that are in the body of the journal article. And then, of course, you run a big plagiarism check to see where these worthies have stolen either their ideas or lifted entire paragraphs. There was the estimable Miss Gay, who was the president of Harvard, who not only plagiarized in her articles, she even plagiarized acknowledgments. Talk about incredibly lazy and wrong-headed. But I want to talk to you about a snapshot in time that was recent. And that would be Arming America, The Origins of a National Gun Culture by Michael A. Belisales. There's a guy out there by the name of Clayton Kramer, a gun enthusiast, a Second Amendment enthusiast, a historian of merit, in my opinion. Like me, not a credentialed historian, but an amateur historian. But the book came out. So it wins the Bancroft Prize in 2001. It later became the first work for which the prize was rescinded. Here's the thesis of Arming America, is that the gun culture in the United States did not have roots in the colonial and early national period, but arose during the 1850s and 60s. The book argues that guns are and were uncommon during peacetime in the United States during the colonial, early national, and antebellum periods. For those who don't know, we're going to call that from 1700 until the end of the 19th century, and that guns were seldom used, and that the average American's proficiency in use of firearms was poor. Well, it turns out that yes, that prize was rescinded because it was so awful. And again, I thank Clayton Kramer for discovering this. Roger Lane reviewed this in the Journal of American History, and he said that the book's research was meticulous and thorough. He wrote that Belisales had attacked the central myth behind the National Rifle Association's interpretation of the Second Amendment. Lane declared Belisales' evidence so formidable that if the subject were open to rational argument, the debate would be over. Another one, Peter S. Onuf, called the book a myth-busting tour de force. Enter Clayton Kramer. An amateur historian and gun enthusiast, Kramer, who had been skeptical, this is quote, Kramer, who had been skeptical of Belisales' thesis since reading his 1996 article, later argued that the reason why historians swallowed Arming America's preposterous claim so readily is that it fit into their political worldview so well. They didn't even pause to consider the possibility that something wasn't right. Historian Peter Charles Hoffer, an advocate of gun control, lent support to Kramer's charge when, in a 2004 examination of the Belisales case, he noted that influential members of the historical profession had taken strong public stands on violence in our society and its relation to gun control. For instance, the academics solicited for blurbs by Belisales author Alfred A. Knopf were ecstatic in part because the book knocked the gun lobby. Now, in the end, according to Robert C. Williams, the politics of the issue mattered less to historians than the possibility that Bella Seals might have engaged in faulty, fraudulent, and unethical research. As critics subjected the historical claims of the book to close scrutiny, they did demonstrate that much of Bella Seals' research, particularly his handling of probate records, was inaccurate and possibly fraudulent. This criticism included noting several serious errors in the tables published in the book, as well as the Journal of American History article, namely that they did not provide a total number of cases and gave percentages that were clearly wrong. Now, in two scholarly articles, law professor James Lindgren of Northwestern University noted that in Army in America, Bella Seals had purported to count guns in about 100 wills from 17th and 18th century Providence, Rhode Island, but these did not exist because the decedents had died intestate without wills. Purported to count 19th century San Francisco County probate inventories, but these had been destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire. On this point, Bella Seals claimed he had actually consulted the more complete archives at nearby Contra Costa County, but the committee also disputed this claim. He reported a national mean for gun ownership in 18th century probate inventories that was mathematically impossible, misreported the condition of guns described in probate records in a way that accommodated his thesis, as for instance claiming that in Providence records most guns were listed as old or broken when fewer than 10% were so listed. He miscited the counts of guns in 19th century Massachusetts censuses, had more than a 60% error rate in finding guns listed as part of estates in Vermont, and had a 100% error rate in the cited gun-related homicides of 17th century Plymouth Colony. Critics also identify problems with Bella Seals' methods of citation. Kramer noted that Bella Seals had misrepresented a passage by George Washington about the quality of 3 poorly prepared militia units, as if his criticism applied to the militia in general. Washington had noted that the 3 units were exceptions to the rule, but of course he didn't include that. There was an Emory investigation, a concomitant resignation. In 2002, the trustees of Columbia University rescinded the Bancroft Prize, the first such action in the history of the prize. Alfred Knopf did not renew Bella Seals' contract, and the National Endowment for the Humanities withdrew its name from a fellowship that the Newberry Library had granted Bella Seals. And as one gentleman said, quote, Bella Seals' condemnation by Emory University, the trustees of the Bancroft Prizes, and Knopf provided the gun lobby with information to blast the entire history profession, even though H. Law, the Amahundro Institute, the OAH, and the AHA rushed to his side and stated principled objections to the politicization of history. They hesitated to ask the equally important question of whether he had manipulated them and betrayed their trust. End of quote. What I find so revealing about this snapshot episode that I'm using to be illustrative of what's coming out of the academy and the university is that what happened with Bella Seals is not unusual. What's unusual is that the public knows about it. I would suggest to everybody within earshot of this podcast that there are journal articles in every academic journal in America. By the way, I hope that you're sitting down. There's no exact number for the total number of those academic journals, but there are tens of thousands apparently, with some sources indicating that the number of peer-reviewed journals could be around 25,000 to 35,000. The overall count of all academic journals, including non-peer-reviewed, and those in different languages, is likely 40 to 50,000. So the number of academic papers published per year is also rather imposing. Of course, the journals would be collections of those papers. And how many of those papers have had significant problems when it comes to footnote citation in the STEM fields, reproducibility, and those kind of things? It is legend and legion. So I think there are so many things wrong with the government education system, K through PhD, in America specifically, and as I want to say by extension, other English-speaking countries, or even those that don't but share our Romance language in Europe, where you find a tremendous number of these kind of academic shams, scams, and frauds going on to such a large extent. And shout out again, Mr. Musk, if you're listening, and I doubt whether you are or not, please find an AI agent that one of your teams can assemble that will scour those 25 to 35,000 academic journals, not only for the year in which they are published, which would be the most recent year, but going back over time and developing some kind of algorithm that can suss out, tease out, and reveal to the world the amount and magnitude of academic fraud that is going on in America. It is a tremendous amount of money, which brings us to the original point of this particular episode, which is where I'm trying to make the case why the K through 12 schools are a preamble, but the finishing house, the orchid house, the place where all the delicate communist flowers bloom and come into their adulthood and go out to have their way with the world, it is the college, it's the academy, it's academia, it's the university. Because what you find time and time again, for those who look at the world through a Marxist, Marxoid lens or a government supremacist lens, or have this illusion that socialism, communism, under the rubric of government supremacism, that central planning works, and that, contrary to what James Buchanan taught us concerning public choice theory, which argues that individuals in the public sector, the government sector, act out of self-interest, just as they do in the private sector. That seems to be something that comes from the University of the Intuitively Obvious, and I am so fond of his rather elegant riposte one day to someone who was asking him, where he said, well, what is public choice theory? It is simply politics without romance. A core concept in public choice theory argues that these government actors are not altruists, but acting in their own self-interest. So I brought you to this conclusion and provided you with this raft of evidence to make the point that the entire corpus of advocacy for communism, socialism, government supremacism, central planning, and the total control and demolition and destruction of free markets and the billions of atomistic human transactions that take place in what Ludwig von Mises would call human action, that they're constantly stymied by a political class that has a very certain investment in trying to make sure that maximum government is never questioned. And one thing that I always find so surprising in my life, and again, we will employ the common characterization of left and right, is that as a trained Austrian economist and a former forensics coach and such, I find that when I have discussions with those who tend to be left of center, the more left, the more extreme this seems to be, their rationalizations, epistemology, and intellectual ability to Socratically drill and even answer to cross-examination that is rather vigorous is always minuscule and usually results in name-calling and true Scotsman's fallacies. As a matter of fact, it's a circus of fallacies that I find again and again when it comes to dealing with folks like this. So why do I bring all of this up in my podcast episodes and my entire raison d'etre with doing Chasing Ghost and examining all the aspects of irregular warfare? Is because I have to understand the human actors in these conflicts. And what you find, if you examine the Spanish Civil War and you examine communist civil wars or communist impositions in intrastate or interstate competition in which there are communist forces, is that the amount of moral depravity, the engagement in the kind of killing that takes place, in this case, as the authors of the Black Book of Communism were criticized for, and I urge all of you to buy that book and put it in your library if you get the chance. It is hair-raising. It will leave scars on you intellectually and morally, but it is a tremendous boatload of case studies and showing you why communism always ends in only one fashion, and that's where that tiny sliver of the nomenclatura, those people on top in a given communist politburo, are there to ensure, whether they acknowledge it or not, that the majority of people living under said government are not going to live as well as they would in free markets with individual liberty and freedom. But guess what? It turns out for 20-somethings and 30-somethings that populate so many of the Antifa plus resistance and insurgency movements in the United States and the West tend to fly flags with hammers and sickles, and they tend to have a Marxist lens through which they view the state and through which they view their fellow man, and they are convinced, almost to a man and a woman, that it is only under the yoking of the individual to collective will that their rainbow and unicorn fart nirvana of communism, socialism, whatever government supremacist rubric they are working under and laboring under at the time, is the only way for things to happen, and that violence is the answer. I'm not saying that violence is the answer for the majority of the professoriate, for all people who profess communist or socialist ideals, but I am telling you that when it comes to Antifa, to fully understand what you're looking at is that you must understand how communism works in the minds of those who profess that as their end goal and template for what they wish to do. Now, communists, though, do have some advantages when it comes to insurgencies. As I've mentioned in past episodes, when I've talked about the French Foreign Legion fighting in Vietnam, when I've talked about communist China on occasion, when I've talked about the roots of Russian Bolshevism from 1917 until the early 1930s, and all the rest, the tremendous amount of discipline, which comes from both self-discipline of individuals in the movement, and also the discipline of knowing that if you don't fight for them, you will end up dead nonetheless. So it's somewhat of a Hobson's choice when you're fighting in these armies. But there are true believers. There are those who think that, well, they did not ply the government supremacist trade, communism, socialism, national socialism, whatever the ism is that is assumed, they have not done it as well as we're going to do it contemporaneously. And we have all the answers, again, probably practicing that historiographical fraud of presentism and thinking that they have all the answers and they are thoroughly convinced. So, yea and verily, what the point that I'm trying to make here is not only does college inform the backbone and probably the arterial bloodstream of all of the communist insurgency tactics that we are presently seeing employed, but this is a way to wholly see the enemy in a realistic and rational fashion so that you know how they operate and how they think. One of the critical things that intelligence officers, or even intelligence non-commissioned officers serving in the U.S. Army or any army for that matter, I mean, look what the Vietnamese were able to accomplish against first world foes, in this case both the French and the United States, with very keen tactical, operational, and strategic intelligence, was they knew what made the enemy tick. And that's also important here. We must be 10th men. We must be contrarian. We must be those who are red teaming what's going on so that not only can we project what the enemy's going to do, disposition, composition, that would be where are they going to be, what forces will they bring to bear, but what are their operational and strategic objectives? How are those communicated in the strategic narrative? How are those things communicated in video? How are they communicated in recruitment? What manuals are out there for them to use these as a means to expand their ranks? All of this stuff is available to those who are interested. One of the problems I see in large central governments, and that would include the United States, is they tend to get hidebound in the way they apprehend the world. And unfortunately, there is a law bureaucracy. I'm a big fan of Jerry Purnell, and I've had the pleasure of working with one of his sons, who apparently, I think he's a retired naval commander, and he's a very keen defense analyst. And he's sort of my connection to this fellow whose works I read in my youth and even past my youth. He says, quote, in any bureaucracy, the people devoted to the benefit of the bureaucracy itself always gets in control, and those dedicated to the goals that the bureaucracy is supposed to accomplish have less and less influence, and sometimes are eliminated entirely, end of quote. Adam Carolla makes a great point when it comes to this. And his point is that those left of center tend to be concerned with process. Those right of center, again, I'm entertaining those because that is the framework upon which most people understand these kind of things, of getting stuff done on the right. And because they're not so concerned with process and getting things done, they tend not to be politicos, which is why you find that political circuses and representational assemblies and such attracts people who are attracted to simply doing process and never achieving what they need to do. In bureaucracies, those who achieve the goals of the bureaucracy are going to be looked at askance by others within said bureaucracy, because if you achieve the goals, why must you exist any longer? And that's a big threat to those who wish for it to go on as a self-perpetuating machine. Bupert's corollary to Acton's axiom is that power attracts the corruptible and absolute power attracts even worse. And hence, when you look around the world within our contemporaneous time, and then you look back in history, and you find so few large, Leviathan, all-consuming bureaucracies that really achieve the things that they set out to do, accepting the aggrandizement and expansion of power for those politicos in power. There was even a gentleman who proposed a second iron law bureaucracy in a similar spirit. Quote, systems complexify. Any bureaucratic system will tend to accrete complexity and layers of control unintended by the original designers, but necessitated by the broader context. End of quote. I think there's a lot to be said for that. For my longtime listeners, you know that I am very fond of Nassim Taleb's notions of fragility and anti-fragility, and that if you look at the ecology of those notions, bureaucracies tend to be very fragile indeed. Fragile in a decision-making process, fragile in their ability to take the process and have it lead them to a concrete solution set that lessens the need for them to exist in the first place. Because think about it from simply a human action perspective. Would you really want to, in a large aggregation of individuals, a collective as it were, want to solve the problems that would put you out of a job? Probably not. Now, of course, we could go on here again and again to look at laws and corollaries and human behavior and the ecology of corporate organizations or government organizations. But I do want to talk to you about Archibald Putt's law and the successful technocrat. Quote, very simple. Technology is dominated by two types of people, those who understand what they do not manage, and those who manage what they do not understand. I would urge all of you to take a seat. You can even replay that if you want. As a matter of fact, I'll repeat it. Technology is dominated by two types of people, those who understand what they do not manage and those who manage what they do not understand. And what you find there is that it is the latter and not the former that is far more of a threat to people's well-being than not. Now, Putt's corollary follows from that initial law, and it states, quote, every technical hierarchy in time develops a competence inversion. In medical terms, we call this iatrogenic effect, which means that it is not only not going to achieve its mission end state, but it will most likely do just the opposite of what it thought to do. Now, if there were legitimate university or maybe even corporate investigators out there, a great lesson in all three of these things that I've suggested to you in the past 7 minutes can be summed up by observing the behavior of the Los Angeles Politburo in California and its political actors in handling the Palisades fire and what's happened with that. I'm hoping that there may be legitimate scholars in the future who will look at this and consider what are the implications of having a state in this case, which not only in the best fashion of the corollary that I just talked about with competence inversion, put everything in place to guarantee that once that match was struck, once that fire took hold, once those embers were oxygenated, that the disaster that would result from that would be far worse than it would ever be because of bureaucratic neglect, lack of foresight, and the insufficiency of scientific forecasting. None of that happened. And one could characterize what happened in LA as a microcosm, as it were, of the kind of process paralysis, indecision, and iatrogenic effect that takes place in almost all large political systems, regardless of what flag they may fly. Because here's what we know from that last principle. The competence would concentrate in the lower ranks of the tech firms. Competent people would continue to handle the operational side of the technology, while the incompetent ones would be promoted up the technocratic hierarchy. So in the end, when we look at what we have here, what I'm trying to weave together is not a unified field theory, because none of us have that. I'm trying to weave together the narrative framework of what this communist insurgency looks like, where it came from, what is feeding the oxygen to this incipient wildfire that's going to consume the country, but also giving an investigative and forensic tool set to those who are paying attention to know who this foe is, what they're going to do, what they're motivated by, and what impact this is going to have on America as an operating polity. Because this is a time in which, when you look back, you think to yourself, well, when it comes to war, and when it comes to conflict, when it comes to civil war, when it comes to mass war and all those kind of things, for the most part, those who are playing at this complex adaptive systems clash, as I've described before, don't seem to realize that for whatever plans they have laid down, whatever ambitions they may have, they are going to discover in the friction and fog of that collision, technologically, ecologically, human systems-wise, economically, all the factors that make us living human beings in this complex mortal coil, that it is not going to go according to the plans and ambitions of the parties who are fighting each other. So I'd like to leave you with this thought. Framing what is currently happening in what I would characterize as an incipient civil war in the United States is so important to grant the clarity to the life and death choices that are probably on the horizon that are going to change the entire tapestry and fabric of what the United States looks like for the remainder of this century. And I want to leave you with this. It isn't libertarians or conservatives or Republicans or even probably mainstream Democrats, because I'm a member of neither party, so I can cast aspersions on them and wish a pox on both their houses. But in this case, it is not those people I just mentioned who are going to start this civil war. They will certainly be involved in it. But it is always the collectivist factions, the government supremacist factions that start interstate conflicts, that start interstate conflicts, that start all of these things that could lead to, in this case, possibly a hemispheric, if not a world war. But we don't really know. So next episode, we're going to lift up the hood on this particular car, and we're going to examine, well, how does communist insurgency work? Are we seeing some manifestations of it now? And what should the response be? Could I complete that task in the next episode? I doubt it. We'll see what happens. I suppose that this is going to be many parts. But thanks for staying with me this long. I wanted to make sure that I provided you with the explanatory framework and explication that would give us the forensic and methodological tools that we need to figure out not only what is happening now, but forecasting what's going to happen in the future. So, thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, constructive criticism, direct them my way at either my Substack, which you'll find in the show notes. You can email me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. Also, the Scott Horton Academy is live now. And my course, I'm one of 4 academic fellows whose course has been published there. There is a gate. You have to pay to be a member of the Scott Horton Academy. My course is Trail of Tears, U.S. Military Defeat since 1945, where I go in excruciating detail with the conclusion of World War II up until present day, and how the trillions that have been spent on the defense complex that is married and woven into the culture of the United States since that time and its allies has done so poorly. So thanks for listening. This is Bill, out.